Welcome to this edition of Starter TV. I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. We are excited to have Herrmann-Nehdi as our guest today. She is CEO of Herrmann International, an organization dedicated to promoting the whole brain thinking concept, which she explores further in the latest edition of the Whole Brain Business Book. And thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here.
So let's get right into this. What is this whole brain framework concept?
Have you ever struggled to try to understand what someone else was thinking when you were trying to get them to see your way of looking at the world?
Often.
Well, the whole brain framework actually provides you with a very powerful tool to decode how other people are thinking and then better navigate how you can get buy-in, how you can better make decisions, solve problems. It's really a metaphor for how we think. And it comes from 35 years of research, but it allows you to very quickly understand and respond to any kind of thinking situation that you might be facing. So it's a very practical yet science-based way of really improving how you communicate and interact with the world.
And is it a lifelong endeavor process? Your brain is a muscle. You have to keep doing it over and over, or?
Absolutely. One of the things that we do know, here's the good news. The good news is that our brains can continue to evolve and grow and learn. One of the things we know about whole brain thinking is that early in the course of our lives, we develop strong preferences for some kinds of thinking over others. And then occasionally we're confronted with that because a situation may require a different kind of thinking. The good news is you can actually learn to shift your thinking to lesser preferred modes, kind of on demand, once you're aware enough of your own kind of thinking preferences and how you might be able to shift to others. So it really is like a muscle that you build throughout the course of your life, but everybody has access to whole brain thinking.
You talk about optimizing thinking for better performance and results. How can organizations truly achieve this?
Organizations are really a collection of brains, if you think about it. And one of the things that's really powerful about this model is it actually was born inside of an organization. So my father created this while he was at General Electric and head of management education. And he was trying to figure out how GE could better tap into the thinking potential of all of his employees. So it was really born out of a workplace need to better put the company's whole brain to work. What it's really designed to do is help organizations begin to understand first, how are my employees thinking? How are my customers thinking? What kind of leaders do we need to better engage the thinking of all of those who are in our organization, to better connect with our customers? Once you begin to have a common language where you can begin to describe this type of delineation of different kinds of thinkers, you can then begin to improve the way you interact with each other and shorten cycle time, accelerate business results, and make better decisions. So organizations, once they've adopted the common language and understand how they think, can really begin to see significant improvement in results. It's simple, but it really works.
Talking about brain to business based on this whole brain concept and model, can you elaborate on the 4 thinking clusters that you mention often in your book?
Sure. So it's pretty straightforward. If you think about the first one is that logical self. It's that aspect of who we are that likes to break things down, likes numbers, is data-oriented, really interested in the bottom line. Then we've got a more safekeeping self that's going to be perhaps a little bit more hesitant to take risks, but really good at organization and planning and details. Then you've got that more feeling self, really in touch with our emotions, connecting with other people easily, and able to express in lots of different ways. And then finally, you have that more experimental self, more inclined to take risks, liking the big picture, and often a little bit more creative and innovative than maybe some of the other modes. All 4 of these come together, and we use colors to describe them. So the rational self is more blue-oriented. The safekeeping self is more green-oriented, the feeling self more red, and the experimental self more yellow. And that helps people remember the model. It also helps them describe, I need you to shift to this quadrant. Can you come to red with me as we're having this conversation? And makes it very easy, kind of a sort of a backup lexicon for talking about how we work. Now, it's important to know that we all have access to all four, yet we have strong preferences for some over others. And so you might be working with someone who has very strong preferences for the green and blue, and perhaps you have strong preferences for the yellow and red, and occasionally that can kind of feel like you're speaking a foreign language. But once you understand this, you can begin to say, well, maybe I should translate what it is I'm saying to that other perspective so that I can get better buy-in faster.
Now, how do our preferences impact our work choices?
Well, it's really interesting. We found that most people have typically pursued a career path that's in alignment with their preferences, but not always. You know, we get lots of advice early in life about the best career choice that we should make. And we found that occasionally we can be really good at certain things, but not really enjoy it. For me, that was true for math. I was good at math, but oh gosh, if you asked me to be an accountant, I don't think I would have survived. Other people may love music, but they can't carry a tune. So there's a difference between preference and competency. But most people, when they find work that is truly satisfying, truly rewarding, there's a strong alignment between their preferences and the work that they're doing, because they find that they just get great satisfaction, enjoyment out of work. And ultimately, that's what we really want. We spend so much time working. It makes a lot of difference when you actually really enjoy what it is that you're doing. This doesn't mean that we might not want a challenge from time to time, but we found that when you can find that alignment between our preferences and our career choices, you'll see a much more satisfied and engaged workforce.
What's the relationship between preferences and competencies, and can you share an example of this?
Sure, absolutely. So I mentioned a moment ago that I'm actually pretty good at math, but it's not something I really enjoy doing. So math might be a competency. The fact that I enjoy strategic thinking, in contrast, is much more of a preference. When we have an area of lesser preference, it might be harder to develop competencies in those areas. So my lowest preference would be that highly detailed, organized, structured quadrant. Now, if I needed to really put together a highly detailed plan, let's say to go on vacation with my family, I might be motivated to do that. It'll take extra energy and effort for me to do that. So I can develop competencies in areas of lesser preference, but it'll take more effort and energy to actually go there. And so it's important to know where your preferences are. It's also important to recognize that just because someone has a strong preference in a given area, it doesn't mean that they don't have competencies there. It just may mean that they don't enjoy that work as much.
Can you elaborate on the whole brain decision-making step-by-step process? How does it all work?
Sure. Well, I can imagine that perhaps you've experienced what it's like to make a decision and then later on be blindsided and say, gosh, why didn't I think of that? Well, one of the things that whole brain decision-making helps is it gives you a process around which to not get blindsided by a decision that may be overlooked one or two different aspects. So what we invite you to do is to think about, what are the facts that I need to know? What is the data I need to take into consideration in order to make this decision? And then you step back and you sort of say, what about the big picture? What are some context elements that I need to take into account that will probably influence what I need to know? And who's involved? Who might be impacted by this decision? Maybe coworkers, family, customers. And what might that mean in terms of making the decision? And finally, am I going to be in control? Am I going to know what it is I need to know to actually execute against this? When you ask those 4 questions, you ask, what is it about? Why is it important? Who's involved? How will I execute? You'll find that you will really prevent any possible oversights that often occur when we're making decisions. So it's sort of a foolproof way to look at decision making.
Now, what's the role of intuition in decision making, and does it have to have an adverse impact while trying to balance out these decisions?
Well, we all talk about making that gut decision, and I'm sure you've done that before. Now, really, making a decision based on intuition is only using part of our mental process. We know from all of the brain research out there that inclination to maybe just go with your gut can actually be pretty misleading, because we might tend to just go with what we've experienced before. and have a slight bias there.
It feels comfortable.
Feels comfortable.
Safe.
And you kind of go,
Safe,
gee, I
yeah.
might, I know that. I'll just go with that. I see this happen a lot with managers making hiring decisions, and they kind of go, I really like that person. But they don't really go beyond necessarily that. And then they're surprised later when they say, well, how come they're doing this? So part of what we recommend is listen to your intuition. It's one piece of the data, but you're probably only looking at one of the 4 options that you have in the whole brain decision-making model. And that's not enough to really get the full picture.
Okay, what role does gender play in the effectiveness of building teams? And do men and women have really different ways and styles of thinking and advantage one versus the other? Or what's your take on that?
Oh, this is always a great topic, full of lots of interesting debate and dialogue. So we know men and women are different. No big surprise there. We know that their brains are different and that they're structured differently. Our data, and we've looked at millions of assessment profiles, our HBDI assessment, has shown that for many women, there is a different preferred set of thinking styles than preferred thinking styles for men. Now, that is not predictive. So you'll find women who have similar. A female engineer might have similar thinking preferences to a male engineer, or a female musician might also have similar thinking preferences to a male musician. But what we found is that all in all, women do tend to have a slight preference for the more relational kinds of aspects of how we think, paying attention to people, paying attention to what's going on with others, being sensitive to emotional intelligence, being able to express in ways that are quite different, perhaps. Now, what are the implications of this? If you have only gender as a single parameter for building a team, if you build a gender mixed team, you will get greater diversity of thinking. And that diversity of thinking will add value. In fact, McKinsey did some really interesting research, and they showed that companies that have gender balanced employees and teams actually perform 15% better than those that are not gender biased. So there is a bottom line outcome. Now, if you are looking at, okay, what might the implications be? Our recommendation is always look for gender basis as well as thinking differences, because you can have an occupational group that is male and female and still have more similarity than difference because of the occupational focus. So you want to be looking at both. But I strongly recommend gender inclusion whenever you can bring it in. It gives you sort of an automatic path to cognitive diversity, which will lead to better decisions and more innovation.
And what can we learn from each other, you think?
There's so much to learn. How much time do you have?
And do we truly, though, do we learn from each other?
Well, it's really interesting. Our research has shown that opposites tend to attract. So we have an opportunity to learn every single morning as we interact with our family members and our spouses. And we have plenty to learn from each other. In fact, when we look at partnerships, we find that because those opposites have attracted, we find some interest and difference. And then we kind of have to deal with the differences when we're trying to make decisions or work with each other. So we have a tremendous amount to learn from each other, not only as different genders, but also as different thinkers. And that is truly how you're going to solve problems most effectively, is when you bring in those different perspectives. So my bias is always look for some other outside thinking input, and you'll be better off for it.
At the top management level, can knowing each other's differences lead to cultivating better relationships?
Senior teams and top management is always a really interesting group to work with because the stakes are huge. In many instances, I know, and I'm a senior leader myself, there's been some ego development throughout the course of their careers. And relationships are so important. And so one of the things that we have found is really impactful in working with a senior team is to take that time to provide an understanding of how each other thinks on the team first. And what that does is it gives you context for behavior. Why is that person behaving in the way they do? Why do they consistently respond to my ideas in this particular way? They just think differently. It's not because they're trying to be difficult. So that context really can improve the relationship and save time and frustration in senior team meetings. But also, it's really important for senior teams as they look at those who report to them to understand how they can build more effective relationships. We know from Gallup's data that the most important factor in terms of employee engagement is the relationship with a manager. So building that relationship between a senior manager and their direct report is really crucial in terms of getting employee engagement. So you really can improve the quality of relationships, and that makes everything run more smoothly. It's really worth the investment in time.
While hiring or selecting new members for your team, do leaders/managers have preferences for candidates who tend to think like them?
It's so interesting. You know, you sit down and you'll interview somebody and you'll say, boy, that's a smart person. And when we looked at the data, we found that we definitely have a proclivity to think people who are really smart often have got some of those characteristics that we also have. It's a bias that we have to be very careful about, because that comfort zone that we might be in, where we feel like we can communicate easily, we get the way that person thinks, can also be a trap. In many instances, the best leaders are hiring people who are actually complementary to their thinking, to provide that other perspective. So if you fall into the trap of hiring somebody who thinks very much like you, chances are you're going to get confirmation of your ideas rather than getting a very effective counter-proposal that may really be essential for what it is that you need to get done. So you have to be careful. I have found that unless it's very explicitly described in a job description and in an interview process, left to their own devices, it's very easy to just fall into that trap of thinking someone is really smart because it's kind of like looking in the mirror. So it's something to be very wary of.
And then how can this lead to problems with team management at a later stage?
Well, when you have a homogeneous team, and I worked with a group of engineers who had very similar thinking preferences, and they pretty much would get into a meeting and they were all about the data and the product and breaking things down. Only problem was that their least preferred quadrant was that red people-oriented quadrant. They were very analytical and logical, more blue-oriented in our model. And so the customer was always overlooked in every single one of their meetings. And they kept having these recurring issues with not meeting customer needs because they sort of ran out of time. They had so many other things to talk about. So what they discovered that they would need to do, and if you have a homogeneous team that thinks similarly, determine what your least preferred quadrant might be, and then start your meetings with that. So it's a best practice when we look at organizations that really apply whole brain thinking well, that they'll actually start a team meeting with their least preferred to make sure that they devote the time and energy to that. And homogeneous teams can be incredibly efficient and effective. But in today's world, diversity of thinking is most often what is required in problem solving, which is where a lot of teams spend their time. So more often than not, you want more diversity than you do homogeneity. But there are times when a homogeneous team can be very effective. Just be careful not to get blindsided.
Communication is vital for business success, obviously. How can leaders ensure the information shared is understood as intended?
Well, first and foremost, it starts by thinking about who's listening. So often, I find it's easy for all of us to communicate in a way that we think sounds really great. So we'll pick words, phraseology that resonates really with us. And what's a much more effective approach is to stop and think, okay, who's listening? And what is it that they need to hear to get buy-in? A great way to use the whole brain model is to stop and think about how might somebody with more of a blue-oriented preference, actually, what might they need to hear? They're probably going to want some data. What about somebody with more of that green-oriented preference? They're going to need something that's pretty well laid out and well structured. How about somebody with more of that red-oriented preference? They probably are going to want some stories and some emotional engagement. And what about the yellow? Big picture, they'll want some context. Start by really providing people with an understanding of the context of what it is that you're sharing. Now, if you don't know your audience, you need to make sure you hit all four. Some years ago, we worked with a large group. It was a division of 600 people. They ran a huge program together for one day with their leader. We talked about whole brain thinking in the morning, and everyone got the results of their HBDI thinking preference assessments. We were due to have lunch with the leader. He came up to us afterwards and said, "I am so sorry. I've got to cancel lunch." And we said, "Is everything okay?" And he said, "Yeah, because I need to rewrite my comments for this afternoon because I was writing them for myself. And I now realize
oh my goodness,
I have to speak to all four of these, and I wasn't prepared." So I thought, okay, I think he got it. That's really what leaders need to be doing.
Now, how does the quality of managers' direct report relationships influence the level of delegation success? And can you share an example of this?
Sure. I actually met with a manager the other day, and his first comment was, gosh, I don't understand why Tim never seems to execute the way I would be doing it. It's so simple. I mean, isn't this the right way to do it? And so when we talked a little bit about that, it was very clear that what this manager was not doing was, first of all, understanding that there may be more than one way to actually do something, but also taking the time and energy to frame up the delegation task by being very clear in blue. What's the goal? What's a metric that we can say will actually be a great measurement of how well this is working? Is there a deadline or a timeline or a process that's essential in the green that you need to follow? How do you feel about this process, and who else might need to be involved in the red? And then finally, why is this important in the yellow? Why am I asking you to do this? If you actually elucidate your delegation task by visiting each of those 4 points, you probably will see that you won't be surprised, and the results that you get will actually be a lot more satisfying, and the other individual will know what it is that's expected of them rather than trying to figure it out. So that's a really, really fantastic way to ensure that you get good results from your delegation.
Non-alignment, which you talk about in your book, assigned work or being a misfit at work can lower employees' productivity. How can HR managers work towards solving this misalignment issue?
We've all had folks working with us or for us who, they kind of drag themselves into work. And you can just tell, and it's kind of like they're just trying to resurrect that focus and that energy. And so that misalignment is usually pretty obvious. I find that most organizations, when they create a job description, it's all about the description and maybe the competencies inside that description, and less about the connection between that individual's motivation to actually complete the work. I found that a very simple question around what is it that brings you the most satisfaction at work can bring forth a lot of insight around what really motivates an individual when they're on the job. Now, we don't always have the option of perfectly aligning people with what they enjoy most on the job. But when you have that conversation and are pretty clear about, okay, understand that there are aspects to your job that you may not enjoy as much, let's make sure that we can find aspects that you will really dig into and get great satisfaction from. You'll see that you'll get a lot more discretionary lift in terms of productivity. And some years ago, an ad agency had hired a really high potential young man. This guy was fabulous. Put him in an account management role, and it was as if they were pulling teeth to get him to finish his work. They thought, gosh, high potential, what went wrong here? The HR manager, familiar with whole brain thinking, sat down, did an assessment, they talked about it, and they realized that the creativity that this young man brought to bear really meant that he needed to be on the creative side of the house. They found a way to move him over to a different position, and the following year they won an award based on his work. So when possible, making that alignment happen is when I believe HR managers are doing their best work. And you can see great results as an outcome.
What are some of the tips you would want to share with coaches and mentors to improve their learning outcomes?
Well, Coaches and mentors, I think it's a great opportunity for the coach and the mentor themselves to stretch their thinking and learn how to be more in alignment with the person they may be coaching or mentoring. So it can be very useful to ask the person that you're coaching or mentoring, what way do you learn best? What would be the most effective way for you to gain insight from our relationship? We worked with a university for several years who, as part of their MBA program, would use the HPDI assessment as a way to introduce a coach to their coachee. And they started their conversation by saying, how are we similar and how are we different? And how can we take advantage of these perspectives? And then they had a common language around which to navigate. You know, I'm not getting what I need more structure. Or can you stop and kind of explain to me why this is so important? And it sort of took the lid off of what is sometimes an uncomfortable ramping up process where you're not exactly sure, how do I ask for what I need, or how do I make sure that this person's listening and learning from what I have? Another organization put together a mentoring program that really wasn't working too well. This is actually the U.S. Navy. And so our partner there decided that she would match people based on similar thinking preferences using their HPDI data. And at first this was a little controversial. Are we going to be kind of manipulating people by matching them up like that? What was really interesting is that out of 700 pairs of mentors and mentees, only 2 didn't stick for the duration because people felt comfortable with each other. They felt like, wow, you're somebody I can learn from. So if you have an option, look for those similarities. Reach out and find those uncommon commonalities that you may have between you. And then, if possible, have them complete an assessment, do an assessment yourself. Of course, the HPDI provides you with that thinking model, and then use that as a way to accelerate your ability to communicate and make it easier for that person to learn.
What are the traits of a multi-dominant leader?
Well, a multi-dominant leader is agile in their thinking. And the way I define thinking agility, it is the ability to shift your thinking as the situation requires it in a very deliberate and intentional way. So that means if you're facing a situation that requires a lot of analysis and looking at data, you're able to shift your thinking to meet the needs of that situation, rather than just kind of bringing your normal set of thinking skills to bear for every situation that you have. Now, most leaders will do this to a certain degree. And I have found, having worked in this field of organizational development and business for the last 30 years, that never before have leaders been put in a position where they need to be agile. They're being asked to do so much more than they initially signed up for, or perhaps were trained for or schooled for. So there's really an opportunity, I believe, for leaders as they look at every situation that they're engaging with to ask themselves, what kind of thinking is required here? And if that's not my natural preferred mode of thinking, who can I bring to bear with me to engage in a thinking journey that will allow me to really dig deeper into this particular thinking perspective? And that way they will actually find themselves sort of building that mental muscle and truly becoming adaptive, situational, and agile leaders, which I'm hearing every organization I talk to today, thinking agility or agility is almost always in their competencies as really required for leadership.
What steps can multi-dominant leaders take to ensure a team culture of sustained high performance?
Well, first and foremost, they need to be pretty situational and agile in their own thinking. Actually, leaders of great teams tend to almost play the role of translator. They make sure that everybody on the team has got a voice, whether they have a different kind of thinking perspective, as in our model, whether they're more introverted or extroverted. They make sure that each player brings to the table their best thinking. And great teams tend to actually honor each of the 4 quadrants of the whole brain thinking model. They're clear on their goals and purpose in the blue quadrant. They have very clear processes and they hold each other accountable in the green quadrant. They trust each other and they get to know each other in the red quadrant. And then they tend to be able to actually have a vision of where they need to go. And they can deal with what I like to call creative contention, which is that ability to have very diverse, different ideas and kind of debate those without people taking it personally. A great leader helps a team navigate through that process and make sure that every team member brings their best thinking to bear for the project at hand.
What are some of the ways that employees can improve their chances of getting a buy-in to their ideas? And can you share a case study or an example of this?
Yes, it's one of the things that I think many employees struggle with. It's sometimes called managing up or getting that pitch accepted for whatever it might be, a new job, an idea, a project. So one of the best things to start off with is to, in my view, actually pitch to each of the four quadrants. Think about, okay, if I were pitching to somebody, and imagine role play, and if you have somebody you know who thinks that way, it's even better. What do they care about? What language would they use? What would they be looking for? Years ago we worked with a large international lighting company. And that lighting company had made the decision to move production overseas to bring down the actual manufacturing price of one of their key bulbs. Folks in the local plant were devastated. We're going to lose that business. Our jobs are going to go. So they asked for the opportunity to do some, come together and do some creative problem solving and see whether or not they could really come up with an idea. They leveraged the thinking on everybody in the group and were able to actually, through a very creative idea, reduce the cost below the cost that it would have been overseas. However, when they first started to think about that idea, it was all about the creativity that they felt was most important. And then they realized, oh my gosh, our leaders actually need to hear the bottom line results. They don't really care about the creativity. And so they completely reframed their pitch to focus on the bottom line outcomes, exactly how it was going to work, and then snuck in how it was going to help really reduce the number of layoffs in the plant, and as well as how they came up with that idea. And they were able to get buy-in to that idea because of that. So think about who it is that you're pitching to and develop a pitch that resonates with each of the four quadrants. We have lots of tools on our website, thewholebrainbusinessbook.com, where you can go and look up how might I think about each of these four quadrants and pitch to them in a certain way if you're wondering how might I do that.
What is adaptive and integrated thinking, and why do leaders at all levels require that we all adapt this way?
Well, you just kind of wake up in today's world. And the first thing you have to do is, as soon as you get into the office or turn on the television or listen to what's happening in the world, is adapt. So integrative and adaptive thinking really draws on all of the brain power that you have available to you. I find that to maintain your competitive advantage as a leader, that ability to flex and shift modes, which we all can do, it may be a little uncomfortable, is what brings that competitive advantage to your role as a leader, and which, in kind, makes your business and your organization have a competitive advantage. So what it really means is being attentive to what's happening in the world around you. It can be pretty easy to kind of just burrow down into your space when things get pretty crazy and change starts to happen. By lifting your head and kind of having that peripheral vision and paying attention to what's happening around you, you can actually adapt before the change happens and really, reduce the chances that you're going to get caught off guard, as well as your organization. So I believe it's a competitive advantage strategy for most leaders.
If an organization is out of an alignment, can the customers notice it? And how can leaders and employees work on improving this misalignment?
So every organization you work with today, they've got values, often printed on a plastic card or up on the wall. And not too long ago, I was actually a customer of an organization, and part of their value statement was, customer is number one. And I had a very inconvenient situation with this particular organization that did not deliver what I had expected. And so I reached out and I thought, they say customer is number one. And asked for them to rectify this and was unable to get anybody to respond, especially at the service level, but even when I started ratcheting up. And so finally I asked the most senior person who I finally got on the phone, I'm familiar with your organization, and I noted that in your value statement you said customer is number one. I'm not really feeling like number one right now. Can you speak to that, please? And there was this kind of awkward pause in the other end. It was like, okay, point well taken. Let me see what I can do. So yes, customers will absolutely know when there's not alignment. It'll feel like you're dealing with two different companies on some occasions. And it's really the responsibility of senior management first, as well as those throughout the organization, to get very, very clear on what your values might be, and then to translate those into behaviors. So I lead a global organization, our company Herrmann International, and because I'd seen this happen in so many other companies, what we decided to do was take a look at our values and translate that into 25 key fundamentals. And those are behaviors that are really clear. Everybody understands exactly what it looks like, and it allows managers to hold those that they work with accountable, and it allows those who come into my organization to understand exactly what is expected of them. And if something doesn't happen well, we can say, fundamental number 14, one Herrmann, you weren't behaving as if we were one global enterprise. How do we work on that? And it really facilitates your ability to get that alignment. And of course, we have our fundamentals across all four quadrants of the whole brain model. Can't help but doing that way, but which really ensures that we're taking care of all of our customers. What's really important, though, is getting very clear on what they are and translate those into very specific behaviors that people can understand and actually be held accountable to doing.
Why does strategic planning fail, and what can be done to ensure that it in fact succeeds?
So one of my favorite things about strategic plans is by the time the plan is actually finished, it's almost obsolete, right? The rate of change in today's environment is so accelerated that if you focus on the plan and not on the strategic thinking required, then you will probably miss the mark. And I find that too often, strategic plans are actually operational plans. They're execution plans because the planners were involved in putting it together. There's a reason why strategic is in that name of strategic planning. And that is because in order to truly create a strategic plan, which leads you out into a future, you need to be thinking out into the future. And, as Wayne Gretzky, who was, if you're a hockey fan, used to say, I go to where the puck will be, because that's where I'm going to be able to hit it. A great strategic plan allows you to think about where the puck will be, not where you are today at first, and then to be able to figure out how do I get from here to there in the most effective way possible. And with the rate of change happening, the ability to plan very far out into the future is becoming more and more difficult. So I recommend that people revisit their strategic planning process on a regular basis and almost consider it a rolling process. You need to have that vision, put it out there, develop your strategies, but you have to come back in and check in on a regular basis because chances are something's out there that's disrupting what you thought was true as little as 6 months ago. So adopt a strategic mindset, look out into the future, worry about the plan once you've done that critical work. Don't start with the plan first. That will trap you into tactical thinking, which will not give you a strategic plan.
What are the common pitfalls with company or team reorganizations, and how can these be overcome?
Reorganizations are painful, and it just seems like they happen all the time. You're just finishing one reorganization up, and here comes the next one. I would say in my experience that one of the greatest pitfalls of poor reorganizations is a lack of transparent communication about what is going on. And senior leaders know what's going on. And the failure to communicate that, and this is particularly true in merger and acquisition situations, but all company reorganizations, the failure to communicate effectively and do that in such a way that all 4 different types of thinkers in the whole brain model can truly understand that communication, will really get in the way of everybody's worrying about what's going to happen. So anytime you announce a reorganization, the first thing that happens in people's brains is they just shut down and they start worrying, well, what about me? Is this going to impact my financial security? Is my job going to change? What about those that I work with? What's going to happen to them? What about my family? What does this mean for my future? So if you think about each of those 4 questions resonates with a different quadrant of the whole brain model. If you're able to communicate transparently, people would much rather know the truth and hear it in a way that allows them to then feel trusting of what it is that you're saying. And what that'll do is it'll allow the organization to have better productivity. You're never going to have terrific productivity in a reorg because people are distracted. But if you're clear and you communicate effectively to a variety of styles, most of the time, people will have much greater trust and they will actually be able to get some work done as part of the process. We've got many case study examples of organizations that not only got through a reorganization, but were able to not just survive, but thrive on the other side. And that's really what you want as a result of an organization. We've got many, many examples of that once they've applied a whole brain approach to looking at what it is they need to do and how they need to communicate.
Okay, during a crisis, how does stress and pressure impact our thinking?
Well, I'm sure you're never under pressure.
Never.
No stress at all. In fact, what's really interesting is one of the interesting characteristics of our assessment, the HBDI, is that we look at your thinking in your day-to-day environment and then what happens under pressure or stress.
Don't some people need that to thrive, a little bit of pressure?
Well, some people will say that. Some people will say that and they actually feel like it kicks in some adrenaline for them. So what's fascinating for me is that, let's say even maybe 5, 10 years ago, people would look at that stress profile and they'd say, yeah, that happens to me under stress. I sometimes go there. More and more, what I'm hearing from individuals is my stress profile is my day-to-day profile because that's all I'm living in right now. Pressure and stress is my norm. And stress has an impact on our thinking and our brain. For many people, pressure or stress actually kicks us in to a shift in thinking. And it's really helpful to understand where your thinking goes under pressure or stress, because those that work with you and live with you might think, who is this person and where did they show up? I used to work with a leader, and his assistant would say to me, when she saw his profile and she saw that his thinking shifted towards much more control under pressure or stress, she would say, I was wondering which Paul had come into the office today. And if it was control Paul, then I knew I had to kind of behave differently than Mr. Big Thinker Ideation Paul, right? So it's very useful to understand what happens to your thinking under pressure or stress. For many of us, there is a strong emotional component that kicks in or a desire for control. But for others, it might be, let me solve that problem or let me get really creative. So first, understand where your thinking goes. Second, understand what the implications might be. It could be that it's actually an advantage. You mentioned some people feel like it kicks them into high gear and they like being under pressure, and that allows them to get an adrenaline boost and maybe tackle a problem more effectively. Sometimes that can be true. In other instances, well, let's say you're somebody who goes into problem-solving mode. I know this is true for me. So I become very much a problem solver under pressure or stress. I'm not quite as attentive to the people aspects of things. So it may not be the best time for me to have a one-on-one with somebody on my team when I'm under pressure or stress. And I think my team has figured that out. So it's really getting a grip on understanding where's your thinking day to day, where's your thinking under pressure, get some assessment data on that, and then understand how you can leverage that and maybe not let it blindside you into getting into more trouble.
How can organizations develop effective crisis management programs?
Well, first of all, they have to talk about it. As a leader of an organization, I work with businesses all over the world. It seems like one of those things that you always just put off because it's like, well, we'll deal with that tomorrow, right? And I guess we're in crisis today, so we seem to already be dealing with it. Somebody said to me the other day, and so it's like, why do we need a plan? We're kind of living in crisis mode. First and foremost, it's understanding what could happen, what could go wrong. And I think for leaders, how do I understand how my senior team might be reacting? Then, how do I plan around that? Some really fascinating research that we did in New Zealand looked at disaster recovery and an understanding of people's thinking under pressure and stress as it related to your ability to recover from a disaster. There were earthquakes in New Zealand years ago, and that ability to then respond to the human needs associated with that, to the infrastructure needs associated with that, the economic needs, and then the needs to really be able to understand the impact on the entire country as a whole. All 4 of those areas of the whole brain model really allowed the team to begin to understand, how do we recognize who might be best for what role? How do we best leverage and make sure that we're managing this crisis in a way that deals with all of the aspects associated with it? And you can be much more effective and recover a lot faster if you use a whole brain approach to looking at managing a crisis and recovering from that. So we've got some really interesting examples and case studies and articles that speak to that, but that's one of the best ways. First of all, stop and think about it. Second of all, look at your team and how they think under pressure or stress. Third, use a whole brain approach to come up with a plan.
Change provides a platform for creative thinking, and with a diverse mindset at work, how can leaders make the best of this situation? And can you share a case study about this?
Sure. I think it's important to think about how creativity and change really can't exist without each other. You can't get creative thinking without some change happening, and change almost always spurs some new thinking, or at least it should. And one of our important findings, and actually one of the primary initial research questions that my father was asking as he did this research at General Electric in the very beginning, was, so is creative thinking just about having new ideas, or is it more than that? So indeed, you need a diverse perspective to solve any given problem. And when you think about solving a tough issue, I love the example that Fred Keaton, who was at Caesars organization, he came up with this notion of diverse by design teams. And when you have a really tough problem to solve, an issue that requires some of the best thinking in the organization, they would bring together a diverse group of people to actually tackle that problem. And what they found was that whenever they did that, they could either save significant dollars, they would reduce time to getting something to market, they would increase revenues significantly, and they were able to do that in a much more effective way. Our research has shown that whole brain teams, or cognitively diverse teams, can actually be up to 66% more effective if well led. So if you're looking for innovation and creativity in a group, I strongly recommend to go after something like what Fred put together at Caesars, which is diverse by design teams. And we've got a great case study that really describes in detail how you do that, as well as several examples of how you can significantly improve the outcome of what it is that you're doing by bringing breadth of thinking to bear.
Why is situational wholeness critical for a CEO to succeed?
Well, our data has shown that when you look at CEO data, it's actually the occupation that has the most frequently occurring whole brain profile. In other words, profile that really kind of spans somewhat equally each 4 of these quadrants. Now, less than 3% of the population has got a whole brain profile. So it's somewhat rare. And when we looked at that, we said, and there's a great, we did an in-depth study that's in the book, a whole chapter is devoted to looking at global CEOs. We realized that, in fact, the work is really designed to be whole brain. When you think about it, a CEO has to deal with logic, data, and finance. They also have to deal with processes and execution and getting stuff done. They have to deal with community and their people and communication. And they also have to deal with strategy and vision and the big picture. So most of the time, a CEO has got a very diverse team of functional experts that span the whole brain model. And their thinking actually lends itself to making decisions that take in each of those four perspectives. The most effective CEOs, irrespective of what their preferences are, surround themselves with people who complement their thinking, and then they listen to what each of those different voices brings to bear so that they can make a whole brain decision, irrespective of what their preferences actually are. And that is what's going to give them the greatest outcome.
How does innovating thinking benefit from the whole brain thinking process?
So innovation and creativity are these words that organizations tend to love to throw around, right? We want an innovative culture. We respect and encourage creative thinking. I, first of all, believe that it's really important to define and get very clear about what you mean by each of those as an organization. And then put in place some processes so that you can begin to allow people to understand how to get there. There's this mystique around innovation and creative thinking, and some think, oh, it's only the creatives who can do that, or, oh, that's relegated to R&D. That's no longer the case. Most organizations need innovative thinking at all levels of the organization and can benefit from some training. Whole brain thinking allows everybody to get involved. Our research has shown that it's not just about having a really big idea in the yellow. That's just one piece of the puzzle in innovation. You have to be able to make sure that you can link it to a real problem in the blue. You have to be able to actually execute against that idea. And you need to know whether or not it's actually going to work for your customers. So true innovation actually requires whole brain thinking. And our research has shown that there are lots of different tools and processes that each of these perspectives can use that will bring to bear great new thinking and innovation. And one of the great examples we have is when Microsoft was looking at launching a new Xbox game called Kinect. They had brought us in to actually help them design the most whole brain game possible. So that was an interesting process. And as part of that project, we had everybody on the team complete their HBDI thinking assessment and get their data on their thinking preferences because they needed to know what we were talking about. And interestingly enough, they started applying it to their process, their innovation process to launch and build this new product. They realized that they were spending a lot of time disagreeing with each other when in fact they could collaborate a lot more effectively. What was the result? They were able to they reduced their time to market by 40%. So you can get innovation and great effectiveness when you really apply whole brain thinking to the innovation process.
So what holds businesses back from being creative and innovative, and how should leaders tackle some of these obstacles?
Fear. Fear of risk, fear of difference, fear of making mistakes is the biggest obstacle to creative and innovative thinking in organizations. Creativity and innovation by design mean that you will have some failures, that there will be some mistakes, and that you will have to take some risks. Without actually addressing that and providing some safety and some coverage for people who are doing this work, organizations will struggle to be able to break through to the other side. And our research has shown that there's usually creativity lurking inside an organization. But they may not be willing to raise their hand and say, hey, I've got this great idea, for fear that something's going to happen. So really creating a culture and modeling that from a leadership perspective, that it's okay to make mistakes, that it's okay to take risks, is the first way that you can address that barrier.
What are some of the steps involved in establishing creative process champions?
So creative process champions, one of the things that we know from our research is that different people will solve creative problems differently. So if you think about the whole brain model, you'll see that each one of these four perspectives in our model will approach and use tools that really sync up with their thinking in a more appropriate way. So the first thing that you want to do is get senior management buy-in for a creative process whole brain group that you might use to tackle some tough challenges. Next, identify people who might be interested in doing this. And then administer an assessment. Use the HBDI to sort of say, what are their thinking preferences? And do an audit of what skills do they have? What tools do they already know? And what training might we bring to bear that would help them actually expand that toolkit? Next, what you want to do is make sure that their direct manager is willing to let them participate in a project like this. And you also want to make sure that once you have a big problem that you want this group to come together for, that you pull together a whole brain team of thinkers to tackle the problem. Have them meet with whoever owns the problem. It could be a senior manager, it could be a division lead. Have them sit down and really understand what is the problem at hand. And then let them pick who's going to lead the team. Maybe it's the problem owner, maybe it's somebody else, but let them manage it. And then give them the tools that they need. That might be a platform if they're a virtual team. It could be a space where they actually meet if they're a co-located team. And it's time and protection so that they can actually get the work done. Finally, make sure that it's easy for them to actually present that recommendation and get back to that problem owner over time so that they can monitor and engage with that person as well as present the results. And don't forget to reward their efforts.
Next question, what are some of the ways to reward creative thinking in an organization?
You know, it's interesting. There's a lot of controversy around this. Some people say, well, you know, it should be intrinsic motivation. We shouldn't have to give people monetary rewards for this. Other people say, well, gosh, monetary rewards are, you know, really important. So let me focus on the intrinsic motivation aspects first. For some people, the freedom to be creative is a reward in itself. And just that opportunity to actually bring forth ideas can be tremendously rewarding. So don't overlook that. I believe that when organizations put together programs where there are awards for great ideas, new thinking, etc., and public recognition, that will go a long way for people to feel like, hey, they really mean business here. They're really interested in my ideas. Providing people with training is another great way to reward them. Not only saying, well, gee, we're interested in your ideas, but you can actually participate in a training program. And oh, by the way, your boss is interested in learning about those ideas. Don't make the mistake of having people go to training. I've seen companies do this. Bring back all sorts of new ideas and new thinking, and then have their boss say, I don't have time for that. And I think giving people permission to make mistakes and then take the time they need to have the flexibility to do creative work. There's data that shows that just getting outside for as little as 10 minutes, maybe even just looking outside, can help spur creative thinking. So having the flexibility to actually think and work in ways that may be a little bit different is a great way to actually spur that on. And I believe that those, if you do those right, you can probably feel like you're rewarding people in a great way.
What are mental blind spots and how can we learn to see beyond them?
You know the expression, hindsight's 20/20, right? Well, hindsight's 20/20. It's when you look at that thing that I should have known. How come I didn't see that? It was so obvious. Now it's so obvious. That's an example of a mental blind spot. It's the thing that we overlook in spite of the fact that maybe it's looking us right in the face. And I've seen organizations and individuals and teams have this happen again and again and again. And one quality team that we worked with was struggling to find a solution. They had a quality control issue and they had just sliced the data upside down and sideways. Could not figure out what the problem was. And they had forgotten to look at the people side of things. So when they actually brought in some new thinkers to look at the situation, they realized one of their key people actually was playing poker every Tuesday night. And that was creating all sorts of quality issues the next day. And all of their mechanisms and controls just weren't picking up on that one factor, which once they realized, it was like, okay, that's easy to solve. So It was obvious, but yet it wasn't. So a mental blind spot is anything that you find that you overlook on a regular basis. The best way to mitigate it, understand your thinking preferences, get some preference data on how you prefer to think. Think about those decisions where you've said to yourself, hindsight's 20/20, and then next time, pay attention to that first. If you overlook data, then go there first. If details are your issue, stop there. If it's a people thing, ask others what they might need. And if you don't pay attention to the big picture or what's happening out there in the long term, you better start there. That's the best way to mitigate a mental blind spot. Start with where you are least inclined to look.
How can organizations build entrepreneurial thinking as a core competency?
You know, I think it's Mark Twain who said, people who bring a new idea are considered a crank until it succeeds. And I think one of the things that's tough for entrepreneurial thinking is that it is different. It is risky. It feels uncomfortable. It often may actually be destroying the business that we're in today. So the way you can install entrepreneurial thinking is to create what Gifford Pinchot coined as intrapreneurs. Intrapreneurs are people who are given permission internally to really challenge the current way of thinking, to think like a startup thinks. And I'm very familiar with this because we're a third generation family business. And so we are kind of like a 35-year-old startup. And so we have an entire entrepreneurial effort happening in our company. And that really requires an openness and some protection for some new thinking to bear. And my eldest son, who's bringing a lot of that entrepreneurial startup thinking into the organization, is challenging things left and right. And that may mean that we no longer do things that we've done for the last 35 years. In fact, it does mean that. It also means that there needs to be an openness and willingness to listen and take the risk that might mean that, this new direction may or may not work right off the bat. So finding a way to create that startup culture inside an organization is really critical. If you can't do that, if the culture of your organization is so pervasive and so risk averse, I strongly recommend organizations that they actually take a subculture and put it outside their culture and let that group work as a startup amongst themselves. And maybe that may be the only way to actually make it happen. It's great if you can do it inside, but if you think that the culture is just going to create too much resistance, then create a startup and just make sure they're outside enough that they won't get squashed every time they bring up something new.
Finally, can you share a successful case study of an organization or team using the whole brain thinking concept?
Well, I mentioned Microsoft earlier, and Microsoft's Connect game example, where they were able to, even though, and by the way, they wanted to design the most whole brain game possible. It was actually the most popular game because it was more whole brained. They were able to significantly reduce their time to market, in this case by 40% by applying whole brain thinking. But there are a multitude of examples where senior teams have been able to actually shift their thinking in a way that allows them to make a market change in time before a competitor will disrupt. And a large organization that we worked with was able to make that change. We have seen organizations shift their culture. A bank in Australia used this to compete against, they were the little bank and they were competing against the big Goliath of banks in their marketplace. So they applied whole brain thinking as a way to get really, really good at listening to customers who came into their bank. And so they would look for clues of somebody's thinking preferences. They walked in to ask for a mortgage and respond to that person. And they found that this was their biggest competitive advantage, and they saw significant growth. Were able to compete very effectively against a much larger bank and really kind of catch them off guard because they had a secret weapon, the thinking of their employees. So in most cases, if you just look inside at the thinking that you have available, you've got what you need to gain that competitive advantage. It's just a question of first understanding it, diagnosing what are the thinking preferences we have, then giving people the tools to understand how that's working for them, how it might be getting in their way, and then really creating a culture that leverages cognitive diversity for the best possible thinking, often innovative thinking that you could get out of the organization. That's the secret.
Anne Herrmann-Nehdi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of Sartor TV. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new today. Until next time, I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Thanks for watching.